Preservation is certainly our favorite, and this car really kind of checks all the boxes for what you're sort of looking for. The originality, obviously numbers matching, it really is the ultimate, mechanical spec, being disc brakes and cast iron block. I mean, and the disc brakes are a huge upgrade for these.
So it really is turnkey ready, just had over $300,000 done at Rare Drive with Mark Allen to rebuild it. Hi, I'm Barney Ruprecht, a specialist here at Broad Arrow Auctions and Broad Arrow Private Sales, and today we are at R&R Automotive Restoration here in Mount Kisco, New York, with the one and only Randy Elber, one of my good friends and 300 SL expert, and we've got the unique opportunity where he's going to give us a little bit of his time today to go through one of the most original Roadsters in existence that I've had my hands on, at least. So Randy, tell us where we are, what you do, and your experience with 300 SLs.
So you're at my shop. It's R&R Automotive Restorations. We specialize 50s, 60s European sports cars, specifically 300 SLs, which is a car that we know best. Typically have 3 to 4 in here at any given time. We have 2 gullwings in for restoration, but this car is certainly special. Very much enjoy preservation and discussing details, and this car is a great example to do that with.
And you say, you always have 2 or 3, 300 SLs in at a time. What's your experience level? I know you worked at Paul Russell for many years before starting your own shop.
Yes, I started my career with Paul Russell and Company. I was there for 10 years, bounced around a few places since then, and then we opened the shop in 2018. So we're about 6.5 years now into my own place here, and I'm fortunate to have a lot of these come through here.
So let's get into some of the details about what makes this car special, Randy. So of the 1,800 some odd Roadsters, I wouldn't say this is the singular reference example, but in my opinion, it definitely is one of them. So, walk through some of the things that you don't normally see and shows the level of originality on this car.
Yeah, a lot of what we look at evaluating preservation cars is, again, we're trying to establish what's original and what isn't. Looking at the nose, some things that stand out to us would be, the way this profile gasket is done around the overriders, that the smaller part of the channel, and correct being gray, would be facing the outside.
So this gray piece in here is something that normally gets replaced in restoration or service with like an incorrect black one or something like that.
Yeah, different profile, something that's not as distinguishable and sort of discreet as this is. This is the correct style. Working into the grille, these are really an elaborate fit from a trim perspective. They sit, back into there. There's a flange that rolls out. So, you're always looking for here to see about the way the wing fits, how it profiles into the shape of the outer part of the nose. That can also tell you if it's had, an accident or any sort of history, and you can see how clean and tight, this rolls through in the channel. And that's, another good sign, like what we look for.
Yeah, as they say, it's only original once. This car essentially being off the road for many years, single family ownership from new, from 1977 until 2016, a period of over 30 years. This is definitely a preservation car. I mean, working down the car a little bit further, what else body-wise, before we get into mechanicals, do stands out to you?
One cool detail that we always sort of chase kind of on finishing a restoration is the type of hardware they use to close off the rocker panels. So there's Phillips, there's slotted, there's different hardware throughout the car, but for some reason what's unique to these is there's a slotted screw with a washer hand painted on the ends of the rockers.
So that's this screw down here in the wheel well is what
correct.
We're talking about? Okay.
Yep. Would be correct that it's hand painted, that's correct that it's slotted with a particular finish washer behind it, and that's correct.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier before when I first came this morning, something about the antenna surround there?
So this car ordered originally with a Becker Mexico would add a Hirschman antenna, and it's also incredibly rare to see the actual Hirschman insignia on the bezel for the antenna, which makes you, reasonable that this has never either been out of the car and certainly never been changed.
And following along that point, you said earlier, usually when these trim pieces get re-chromed, you lose some of this, engraving almost in between. So again, to say that this has probably never been, off the car or at least restored in any way.
Yeah, again, these are like really, really small details, which I think are, trying to paint a picture of what this car's been through. But yeah, this stippling that's unique to being under the insignia and across the main chrome bar, typically, you would see if it got re-chromed, you would lose that detail. It's very hard to maintain it going through a re-chroming process. So when you see that, again, another detail that you're like, this is original.
So when you're restoring a car, do you have to do some work to preserve that, or is it just something that you never see?
Yeah, you try to. Unfortunately, sometimes when you get to cars that have been through multiple, restorations or had work done, if that detail's already lost, to try to either replicate it or find another piece that hasn't, had that much work done to it.
And then finally, on taillights, along the same lines of the hardware pieces, these larger slot gaps you taught me many years ago was being original to it.
Right, it seems a little odd for the location to have, again, a slotted screw with such a large slot, which kind of necessitate a really massive screwdriver for a little piece of trim. But that is corrected, those taillights. That's another detail that, how often would you change a headlight or have to go, look through a bulb or something that, you might lose that hardware, and this car still maintains it.
The first thing that hits you, obviously, is the color combination. Triple black, black hardtop, black interior, black paint. Clearly, this paint has been, loved over the years, I will say. You can see swirl marks and stuff from rags over the years. I wouldn't say it's fully original paint. We were looking around before, there are certainly elements of original paint, but, you can see throughout the car it's definitely been loved and preserved over the years.
Yeah, I think one thing we talk a lot about, like preservation, is continuous history. Like, the car's not brand new. It's almost.
You want to see some of these bumps and bruises to put it all together.
Correct, and in a car that's been used and it's been out and been on the road, it's going to go through stuff. It's going to get bumped. It's going to get dinged, and as long as the car's never been fully taken apart or fully restored, it's just part of its story, and it's kind of its patina is sort of a badge of honor for how long it's been maintained in this way.
I always joke the Germans are very precise, and everything about these cars is numbered and has very unique details. So let's take a look under the hood and see what's going on. Unlike some of our Italian counterparts of the Lancia that maybe aren't as precise, the Germans were very particular in their production, and everything about these cars is numbered. So let's take a look under the hood and see what makes this car both original and the touches that you don't see. So I'll let you, walk us through what's going on in here.
Yeah, there's a lot to look at from a detail perspective in the engine bay. Of course, you've got all your mechanical components to evaluate. You've got stuff that's plated. You've got stuff that's painted. Just to give you sort of a quickie rundown, this is a really elaborate tube chassis that kind of pokes through here. It's unique in this location. For some reason, this hardware didn't exist anywhere else on the car, but they're half-height bolt heads here, and here. So these are removable chassis tubes that if the car ever really came apart, you would have to remove these. These still maintain, which is K-Max, which is the proper hardware manufacturer for that half-height bolt. And then these, for some reason, are a different manufacturer, which are NSF half-height bolts still in their location. And to really get the details down, they're a 14 hex 8mm bolt, which is the metric standard for the 50s and 60s is a 14 hex. Nowadays, it's a 13 hex. So if these ever got changed at any point, you would have lost the head markings, or you would have got a bolt that's a different size.
And speaking of head markings, as you say, K-Max is the hardware supplier. So we see the K-Max stamping on here. We see the head stampings of the different manufacturer back here. K-Max is all over this. There are pieces, in here on the hood release. I'm sure you've got over there. Talk us through about those markings and, how you approach a restoration, but then also analyze this as a preservation car.
Yeah, these, the type of washers they use, the orientation of the washers, the head markings on the bolts, all unique to, this sort of era. So K-Max was a big hardware supplier for a lot of the German manufacturers at the time. Mercedes used it quite a bit. There are some other ones, some NSF and Greicas that show up, but K-Max really is the dominant one. So that's sort of what you're looking for when you're kind of poking around the engine bay for stuff that you would have thought reasonably would have been changed, ignition coils or a wiper motor, or, this is the air cleaner, air silencer setup. Anything in here that got, touched, it would have been very simple or easy to lose a 6mm bolt. So when you're evaluating and you're looking and you see all this K-Max hardware with all the proper washers set up and you're looking through, really goes to show you that, one, anybody who's done work in here had a lot of care, or it's really just never been disturbed.
And when you talk about not being disturbed, everybody always talks about matching numbers and matching numbers in many ways is a fallacy for most cars. But when you're talking about matching numbers, you're usually referring to engine, chassis, body. So some of the details we're talking about go way beyond that level and paints the picture even further. This car specifically had over $300,000, if you can believe it, of a mechanical rebuild to make sure that it is usable today. This is not just a preservation car, but it's ready to go, drive 1,000 miles. Mark Allen and Rare Drive, who you know well, rebuilt all of this. But importantly, they left everything alone finish-wise, did they not?
Yes. Yeah, which is great to see. I mean, you would say, reasonable on a preservation car. I mean, it is going to be necessary to go through major mechanical stuff. You're going to have to go through the motor. You're most likely going to have to deal with the radiator and the expansion tank, stuff that.
So those things, obviously, we can tell, like the expansion tank has been refinished and is, for all intents and purposes, new, as is the radiator, as a kind of a wear item, as I would call, but the rest of it's untouched.
Right. And that, to us, I mean, that's to use the car safely and appropriately in the way it was intended. That's really kind of like a necessary evil. But you can see where they tactfully work through some other areas, for instance, down with like the air cleaner or the oil tank. I'm certainly those have been sort of cleaned and serviced, but all their original paint is still left in place. Mm-hmm. Coolant hoses, for example, those have all been replaced, but now it still has all the original style coolant clamps all in place, all oriented, kind of the way we're sort of used to seeing them, which is really, really nice to see.
This brake booster always gets me because this, correct me if I'm wrong, has to be the original ATE plastic bottle.
Yes, and even the weird part about this, with the upper part of that clamp has a lot of tension on it to hold it, and you can see sort of what we would guess would be the original reservoir. It starts to conform to that shape, mm-hmm. So the plastic is like deforming almost to the tension of the steel clamp. So that, I mean, I certainly would argue that's probably the original reservoir, and certainly the cap with the blue style top in there, that's original to disc brake cars.
So let's show us where all the numbers that any layman would look at to consider matching numbers. So on a 300SL, you're normally looking at the chassis number, the engine number, and then many people don't know the steering box number as well as in here. So show us where all that's located.
So yeah, you'll start, your main chassis tag is up on the firewall here. That just shows you kind of the weights, but it also has the chassis number listed. There also is, which is going to be difficult to point out, but down on the front cross member of the frame is where they actually physically stamped the chassis number. Mm-hmm.
And so that's unique to Roadsters. It was different on Gullwings, was it
in a
not?
Different location, correct. Yep. So that tag number, which is the chassis, should match the stamping down there. And then working back from there, you have an engine stamping, which has a tag riveted directly underneath the actual physical number stamping, which goes across the top part of the engine block.
And speaking of numbers, because you can see it there, what are some attributes of being able to determine the original stamping? Are there certain markings? Are there certain types of rivets that you look at to kind of authenticate something?
So the tags are unique in their appearance, that all the reproduction tags I've ever seen never really are exactly, on point to the way that the original ones were. And you would expect to see it faded or deteriorated, or, it's living in a harsh environment, so you expect the paint to be either gone or mostly gone. So the tag is certainly original. In the numbers, the texting is very unique, which we kind of do. We typically compare it to other stuff we know that's original. One cool little detail, as they work through the number sequence, there's little periods placed in between numbers, and it's, on your first glance, you think it's just a round punch. It's actually a square.
Interesting.
It's really, really tiny, but it's hard 90 corners, and that usually when we've seen stuff ground or redone, that little detail gets missed, and it ends up being like a round stamp where they had this really unique sort of square setup.
Interesting. And then we've got the steering box number down in here, and then there's the frame production number down there. That's kind of one of the Easter eggs you also have to look at on any 300SL, because frame numbers, I don't believe, are recorded. They kind of fall in a sequence, or is that the production number? Remind me how that works.
The production number, yeah.
It's a production number. So it's not tied to any one of the chassis, engine, or body numbers. It's a separate number that you have to look at to make sure it's one present and two falls in the sequence of the rest of the car.
Right, correct. Yeah, which is also similar to the steering box and the front spindles. Those components would have been numbered and assembled separately. Mm-hmm. And then eventually when they made it to the car, then they would start recording it.
And all of this is recorded on the build sheet. Mercedes is somewhat unique in that regard, where there is a build sheet. It lists out every number for every major component of the car. And the important thing is, we can tie all of these stampings back to that data card and show that it is the original.
Correct.
So as one of the authorities on 300 SLs in the world, is there anything here that jumps out to you as, really shouldn't be there?
No. I mean, it really is, it's 100% on point. I think what's cool about this, and, being in the mindset to always be learning or getting references to look at and comparing your notes from past ones, where is be pretty confident, this air cleaner, air silencer original to car, they both have a decal on it. And I haven't seen that before. Usually they're talking about washout and grease soiled filter, which is actually this, which that still has that on there, and there's another decal placed here. So these are things about which you would assume, although, you would say the Germans are incredibly precise, on a production car, things are going to change. You're going to have details that are going to be different. Maybe the decal is slightly off or moved or in a different location, or this one you have them redundant, which is, kind of cool to see.
Yeah, and people forget by today's build standards, especially for Mercedes-Benz, back in 1962 when this car was made, it's very much a hand-built, handmade thing. There's remarkable production quality of these cars compared to other things like a Ferrari of the same era. But these things are still very much hand-built and details change and everything. But it's great to see that this car, remnants of a decal, over here, everything is as it should be. Nothing's been erased, so to speak.
Correct. Yep.
So before we close the engine and move on to some of the interior details, and then later on look at it from the underside, one thing I'll touch on is the body number is here, and many people don't know that a lot of the other body panels are also numbered. So if we look on the flange of the hood here, we see that same ending 261 sequence, which ties back to the body number. Are doors numbered or trunks numbered, or is it mostly limited to here?
That was another sort of production thing where you would expect to see them, but you don't always see them.
Okay.
Sometimes they're stamped, sometimes they're written. But, to see a physical stamping, you would expect, digging typically not visible, like readily visible. As you kind of take panels off or dig deeper, you would see it. But what's unique about them is that they are physical stampings. They're not tags or riveted, and you see that stamping and that stamping still super clean, crisp, intact. And
if this had been replaced at any point, we'd know about it. Looking at that 261 tying right down into here, as you say, super clean, crisp punching, no issues, no manipulation there.
Yeah, or even a repaint would probably hide some of that, detail or been painted over a couple times. You would start to lose some of that. So, that number, the spot welds that are still, visible through here unconstructed, this is like really great to see.
Moving into the interior here, Randy, my knowledge level is minuscule compared to yours. All I know is you can never get original leather again once it's been restored because it doesn't match this grain. So I'm going to let you fully walk us through, what is original and what isn't, and take us through the car.
This really is, in my mind, the biggest highlight of this car is how original the interior is. You're correct, the leather type is very unique to this time period, to the way Mercedes treated it. It's correct to see this style of grain, this type of sheen, and also in these wear areas where you can see sort of like a tan coming through. That's correct to the way the leather was originally done. It's top grain dyed. It should maintain the sheen, and as it sort of wears, you get the tan look to come through it. Later Roadsters, this is the correct seat pattern. Obviously, this is the original seat to this car. The way that this leather's done, the way the stitch pleats are, this is correct and 100% original to this car. And as we sort of look at it and you kind of dig a little bit deeper, if you roll this cushion out of here, you can still get to see some of the factory chalk marks that are still present underneath on the seat cushion, which again is incredibly rare to see. One thing we get a little bit excited about to see that it's rare to have such a soft detail sort of maintained in it. So working past some of the leather, you'll see kind of the threshold openings. These start to float a little bit, which is sort of correct. There was originally a tight, real thin foam underneath that sort of deteriorates, so it's common to see these sort of float. The knee roll, which is another unique piece, they're very firm. This is a different style of rubber. It's not a sort of the soft kind of a seat style material. It should be firm and should maintain its shape, which is really interesting to see. If you flip down the glove box, really wild that you still get the original decal that's in place for showing tire pressures and what it was supposed to be originally. It's going to be a little bit difficult to point it, but if you kind of peek underneath this piece of trim here, there's screws that are holding this trim to the upper part of the dash as this lower part physically removes from the car. And kind of touching on what they did with the rocker trim, they would come back in and touch these with body color to sort of hide them because they can reflect off this anodized trim. So they were brushed in with the exterior color of the car. So as you work through here, you can sort of see some of what's left of the original paint touched in on those screws. And again, really, really cool detail that sort of confirms, what we thought or seen, and then, of course, lines up really well with the story of this car. The hardtop, so this car not all cars were delivered with hardtops. This was option with one. Again, never been upholstered. This sort of pattern, kind of the faded color you sort of would expect to see, the perforations going in the back, the leather that's sort of kind of wrinkled and pulled, all correct, all original. Really, really nice to see. And I don't know if my audio is necessarily going to grab it, but these clocks, are different than Gullwings are manual wound Roadsters. They have a little 12-volt wire coming to it that kicks a point set that self-winds the clock. So as you poke your head in here and you get quiet, you can hear it ticking, and then eventually you hear a doop as the point set kicks open, rewinds itself, and lets it wind down. I think it just did it right there. Again, another really cool thing you see that typically most people, in restorations will convert to a quartz, and you kind of lose that kind of cool little detail to it. Car with this sort of mileage, you'd sort of expect the top part of the shifter handle to kind of be worn out, which it is. Shift pattern's still present, but it's a little worn, which is really cool. Emergency brake handle, this top part would be chromed, and then for some reason right on this brake, they blacked it for the remainder part of it. So this little rubber boot kind of, which is still present, sort of shows the break between the chrome and the black. That's correct, probably never been touched, which is really, really cool to see. This one more thing as I'm working through it, there's so many, but in the bottom part of the gauge, if these have ever sort of been redone or gone through, the facing at the very, very bottom underneath, there's an axle ratio written in there on the screen print of the Speedo, and that's important for what the axle would have been originally ordered with, so the Speedo would be calibrated correctly to it. A lot of times we see those when they're redone or rebuilt, you sort of lose that detail, and although the facing looks great, the little small texting disappears, and that's still present, which is awesome.
So you're saying that Speedo is tied directly to this rear axle?
Yeah, that axle ratio, that's going to be stamped on the back of the axle, so they'll have a number, denoting the axle number to the car, but also have the ratio, which will then line up with the number written on the bottom part of the speedometer. The passenger door is the only one that has the grab handle. Driver's doors don't have the grab handle. So it's just smooth over there and you have it here. This is hand wound. So this pattern with the thickness of the way that these are done, that's unique, and it's wrapped over a physical, like the physical handle. So although deteriorate a little bit at the top, certainly 100% original. And then you can also see the backside of leather is still tan. So that's like what I was saying, like the top grain dyed black, the backside should be tan, and it maintains that sheen. And it's nice to see this in such good shape, without even a little bit deteriorated up top, but I mean, again, totally original.
And speaking of originality and good shape, this is a car with, it's rolled over. When the current owner bought it, it was delivered with 4 miles on it, and it just rolled over from 99,000. So this has 107,000 miles on it. Given that level of mileage and the age of the car, I always say there's 2 levels of originality. One is bad, and that's like a barn find where you can't really use it anymore because it has holes and it's deteriorated. This, in my opinion, is exactly as you want it. It's preserved, it's usable. I mean, how would you rate this in terms of preservation and usability?
Yeah, I mean, we talk frequently about it, what is preservation, and kind of with the story of the car, and preservation sometimes it gets tossed in with neglect.
Yeah. And
some of these low miles cars that maybe necessarily weren't taken care of or been off the road for ages or not properly stored, that kind of borderlines neglect that sometimes, they're almost too far gone to be salvageable. This car with history and with mileage and with use, although, sat dormant for a time, was clearly cared for.
Yeah.
And maintained in good shape. Everything that, nowadays we would call, preservation or restoration really is just major service, and service that was technically overdue.
And speaking of service, I still have the or not the original because it was done by an owner, but an original Valvoline, oil change sticker here in the door.
That's awesome.
Those are the details that you don't see. There's a CHP sticker on the windshield. This being a true California black plate car for 40 years, this is the level of originality you want to see.
Yeah, 100%.
Touching on one last piece of, I'd call it interior trim level. It's a cold, 25-degree day outside here in December. So we have the hardtop on, obviously. This is the tonneau cover covering the soft top. Talk us through, again, some of the really small details that a normal person wouldn't know on something like this.
Yeah, so this is the panel. This has to come out in order for the hardtop to go on. So obviously not lost, it's with the car, which is nice to see. But just go through what, we sort of looking at it is, you see sort of this leather, which you kind of touch on and is sort of saggy. That would be correct. I don't think this has ever been upholstered. There was originally a real thin layer of foam that would be expected to be deteriorated, which then would allow this to sort of kind of do the float like this. So it's nice to see that's more common or more to be expected of what of its condition now. Rolling it up underneath, this is sort of a cool, kind of production sort of, detail. This is your cabling and your latch system as this swings up. This handle here is originally anodized, and it's polished and anodized the whole part of the handle. Then they came back in and painted this black, and for some reason just did a hard line right above where that spring hooks in here to allow the handle to return. So a lot of times you'll see, restorations or things like that where, this sort of gets left polished. You think such a decorative piece, why would you go back and paint it black and then just do a random line and, up here to block it? But that is 100% correct.
And to pause on that, how often would you say you see something totally correct like this that's not subject to a brand new restoration with all of today's knowledge, like someone yourself? Like, how many cars come in here for service or start of a restoration where that would be deleted, for example?
Yeah, this sort of information, and we talk about it a lot, is once you lose this, it's gone forever. And thankfully, you get to see cars like this that kind of confirm, sort of what you saw. But again, it's incredibly rare to all this hardware, the way these, for some reason they ran a double set of clamps right here. Same thing, double set of clamps. Like this information is important. Just one, to tell us how to do, a lot of the restoration work. But again, to have something come in that's completely untouched is really rare.
Thinking about, original details like this, again, we can tie this car back to Mercedes, build quality and everything being recorded. We've got a body number here of 261. Again, would you normally expect to see that on tonneaus, or is it, hit and miss with locations?
It's certainly hit and miss. They were fit individually to the car, but again, that's incredibly cool to see. You do see some of these, process marks and sort of fit marks that kind of got painted over. That's what you would expect really on a production-based car to see, but the stamping, that's awesome.
Before we get it in the air and talk about the final numbers on the car, just some, interesting details about this. You are a toolkit guy, you know everything about these things. Before we touch that, Mercedes Hollywood, service the car. There's a stack of papers this thick. Original California black plate car. I mean, look, you've got the original registration stickers stacked up on top of each other about a 1/4 inch. Those are details you can't replicate.
Yeah, this is an excellent toolkit. Again, this is something you almost never see with cars anymore, even on preservation related stuff, because it's what it came out, got lost, misplaced, or whatever. But yeah, this is a complete toolkit. Really, the real kicker here is the air pressure gauge, which is unique to the 300 SLs. That's still in its box, which is, again, awesome to see. Some of the details we sort of work through. The tools, they're always depicted in the parts book, so they're not totally impossible to get it reference on. But one, cool detail especially about the screwdrivers, that this has replaceable blades in it, so you can only run one handle with two. But it's also wood, is also painted black for whatever reason. So you have the ability to swap out this to this and essentially have two screwdrivers, with one handle, but that's 100% correct, in really great shape, which is, again, is awesome to see.
And this type of material, similar to what we learned about from the interior leather, this is, unique to this era of car, not easily replicated.
Right, so tool bags, kind of in a production sort of mindset, don't color match the interior. They weren't built specifically for any one car. They were kind of run down the line. So you'll see, bags with this sort of green canvas. This is all, this is all correct in the style in which it was made, and it shouldn't really necessarily match anything. It would be more correct to see it in a color that has nothing to do with it, which is exactly what this is.
So anything else that we should go on the inside?
I mean, these are your tools. This is your jack and your lug wrench that are snapped into their locations. Like, those are 100% correct. This being a later Roadster, the trunk upholstery is this sort of like generic kind of like black gray fabric.
Okay.
And is also correct to see that this has a snap and mat, which is, shrunken, which is which is
As you
accurate.
would expect.
But also, like, for instance, that panel, that gets screwed in there, that's the access, the fuel filler neck. The carpet was just cut raw, and the piece was just stuffed in there. It wasn't bound or, similar like to how this edge was finished. Mm-hmm. That was just cut to really kind of make it disappear. And again, that's a sort of a detail you see kind of changed a lot on restorations, where it's like they would have, bound it or tried to finish it well. It really was just cut raw and put in there to try to just make it non-discrete.
So this is something, you can look at and use going forward as you restore and service cars to put back the way it should be.
Yeah, 100%. Yep.
While we have the opportunity, it's not so often you get to see both a Gullwing and a Roadster transmission out of the car, because you work on so many of them. So this is a very weird, Easter egg, I'll call it, that I didn't know before you showed me this several years ago. And tell us what we're looking at here and the differences.
So for some reason, it's, the transmissions tend to get swapped or replaced, or parts and interchanged, and there's ability to kind of swap around. So,
and restamp.
And restamped, yeah. So we typically chase sort of the detail stuff kind of more so on the Gullwing, not necessarily the Roadster. But, one thing that's different between the two, which is really important to note, is that the rear cover, which also has the speedometer drive, changes from Gullwing to Roadster. So Gullwing, which is what we have here, this is correct to have it orient facing essentially the driver's side, which is when you're sitting in the car, with the speedo drive over here. On a Roadster, it orients to the other side. So they're really almost mirror images of each other, with the speedo drive facing this way. But this is correct for a Roadster to face out to the right-hand side, which kind of helps as you're sort of talking about the numbers, because the stamping is going to be the main case. Mm-hmm. So the cover could have been swapped or changed or modified or something, even though you had, quote unquote, the correct numbered transmission. So you look for, obviously, the number on the main case, but then also the proper rear cover with the speedo oriented in the correct way.
And just to summarize that, so this is how the car, or the transmission, would be situated in the car, plugged like this. So on a Gullwing transmission, the inlet points over to the driver's side here on the left, and then on a Roadster, that swapped, 180 degrees over to the right side in the passenger. And that's something you can restamp, and, there have been some nefarious procedures with Roadsters and Gullwing specifically, of recent times. And these are the kind of things that you have to look at, which really only experts like yourself know about.
Yeah, it's just digging a little bit deeper than certainly the stampings or the casting numbers or, the build sheet. I mean, all that information's great, but it's part of the story you're trying to build. And, this information and some of the original details and hardware, that's the stuff you kind of line all those up to, to really create the picture of what the car is.
Great. Let's take a look underneath. So looking at the numbers underneath, as you say, so nice how they stamped everything here. So we've got the front left wheel spindle here. We have the right front wheel carrier over there. And
you also get the steering box, engine number, transmission number, and differential number. These numbers are all stamped individually to every car. This corresponds to what the numbers are on the build sheet. So that really helps you kind of paint the picture of like what the car's been through. If it ever got hit in the front or had a major differential problem or a transmission problem, you would expect to see those numbers, gone or changed or be something different, which, again, in this car, it's not. They just help you really understand kind of what the car is, especially with the differential have the ratio also stamped in the back, which corresponds to the gauge that still has the axle ratio written in it. Again, great pieces of information to kind of line up with the car.
So we've been through this car forensically, and I can't thank you for your time, enough today. In my opinion, this is the ultimate spec of how you would ever want a car. Triple black, 1962, which is importantly, disc brake, cast iron block of an engine. This is the ultimate level of preservation as we've seen today. So any final thoughts or advice?
Yeah, this car, preservation is certainly our favorite. And this car really kind of checks all the boxes for what you're sort of looking for. The originality, obviously numbers matching. It really is the ultimate, mechanical spec, being disc brakes and cast iron block. I mean, and the disc brakes are a huge upgrade for these. And really the highlight, I would say, is the interior. It's nicely worn in, broken in. And with all the heavy lifting mechanical done, I mean, this car is just dialed and ready to go.
Yeah, so it really is turnkey ready. Just had over $300,000 done at Rare Drive with Mark Allen to rebuild it. So thank you again, Randy. We are here at your shop, R&R Automotive Restoration in Mount Kisco, New York. I'm Barney Ruprecht.
And I'm Randy Elber.
Thank you guys very much for watching. Please check out the car on our website at broadarrowprivatesales.com.